Hello, everyone. I'm here to record an audio-only summary of the midterm test for philosophy and humor for PHIL-1013. I'm using just my microphone rather than camera because I want everyone to be able to see what it is that I'm talking about. And the first thing I want to do here is to share my screen because that's probably the easiest way to do this. So I'm going to go to full page, and that way we can see exactly what we're talking about here. Okay, so I basically put this together for the midterm, and obviously Module 1 was just an introduction to the course, so not a big deal. But Module 2 is where we actually start to talk about various things that I would like you to consider, and that is the origins, or are the origins and evolution of humor. Now, we mentioned in the course that there's sort of three main theories, but a fourth can also be included, play, which is kind of underlines and emphasizes each of the other positions: superiority, incongruity, relief, and that is amongst all of them, play. Okay, so here we wanted to look at the origins. The word humor comes from the Latin humore, which refers to the liquids that are in our body. And if our body is balanced and we're healthy, then we have a balance of these four liquids: the blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This is an early idea from the ancient Athenians, ancient Greeks, probably going back to the ancient Egyptians as well. But the notion of a sense of humor, that's a much more recent thing. That doesn't start till about the 1800s, during the 19th century, that a sense of humor, a sense of a certain worldview is worth cultivating, because a sense of humor is also considered to be a virtue. And people who are virtuous, going back to the ancients, right? Aristotle thought virtuous people were good. And it turned out that a sense of humor was considered to be a virtue, so a good thing. And we also know that it was part of human social activity. A couple of you wrote about that, that particular aspect of human evolution, being able to be humorous, see the humor in situations, breaks the ice at parties. If there were parties back in the 19th century, I'm sure there were. But the whole idea of humor working as a social lubricant, so that's important. Humans' capacity for spiritual thought is an important one here. And that is this one right here, which I'm just going to highlight. Now, why is that important? Because in humor, something really interesting is happening in our heads. We're holding in our minds two things, two thoughts at the same time. On the one hand, we are considering and thinking what should occur, right? If all things are equal, the following should happen. Where there is humor, providing it's not too far, right? That incongruity doesn't go too far, we consider it humorous. So we are viewing or experiencing something and we have an expectation. We expect it to follow in this manner. And something subverts it, undermines it in some way. And if it isn't super anxiety ridden, we laugh at it. So in our minds, we are holding what should be and what is happening together at the same time. And it turns out that our capacity to do this begins at about the same time as our capacity for spiritual ideas, ideas about the other world, right? The metaphysical world, a spiritual world. And so again, we're looking at reality in front of us and considering and believing in a world that's beyond that. The same kind of thing is happening in humor. We're not thinking necessarily of the world beyond, but we've got these two thoughts in our head: what is and what could be, or what should be and what is. So that duality is what's important. We talked about a difference between amusement, laughter, comedy, and humor. We know that laughter can be caused by a non-humorous thing, but at the same time, amusement is something that's kind of a general thing. Watching cat videos, for example, that's an amusing thing. Laughter might be the response if something that's cute and adorable. Comedy and humor, though, are things that involve what's called a conceptual shift. And that's what I've just described to you, that conceptual shift between what is expected to occur and what actually does occur. And remember, that can't go too far because, as Aristotle warned us, a small deviation is funny. A large deviation can be anxiety-inducing and quite horrific at times. The similarities between humor and philosophy, too. We just spoke a moment ago about humor and spiritual thoughts. Now it's humor and philosophy. Both of those involve an emotional detachment from what is occurring. We never get emotionally involved in a joke, right? We just know that there, three people walk into a bar or someone jumps out of an airplane or whatever it is, but we're never emotionally involved in the characters. They're really kind of caricatures or stereotypes. Often they are nothing but stereotypes. So there's an emotional detachment to the aspects and the events that are occurring. There's also a rational and objective view of the world, right? This ability to kind of see the big picture and point out in our minds those peculiarities that occur that sometimes are funny, sometimes are frightful. But we have emotional detachment from the events, a rational and objective view of those events, and at the same time, what is most important, that conceptual flexibility, that ability to hold two ideas in our minds at the same, our mind singular, at the same time. So what humor excels in is these different points of view. If you ever watch a routine by Jim Gaffigan, for example, he'll actually have and voice different characters that comment on something he says. This is a very good example of both a rational view of the world, but a conceptual flexibility as he shifts from one perspective to the other. He speaks in the first person, then he speaks in the third person, back to the first. That's conceptual flexibility. Now, humor can be mock aggression. You can be sort of aggressively talking, and of course, only verbally with people, and you might be sort of taking them down a peg. You might be satirical or ironic, but it's a kind of mock aggression. But it's done in a safe space because the individuals that are engaged in this dialogue are aware that that is what's going on. This is not a threat, right? It's just to undercut or undermine someone in a humorous way. And the person who receives that comment understands it as so. It's not a challenge, right? It's not a challenge to start something. But it is sometimes very healthy for us to be able to step outside the norms, right? These what are called binding categories to, and I hate this word, but thinking outside the box, but there you have it, right? That's exactly what it means. Using humor, we can periodically step outside of the box. We can step outside of our usual normal activity, normal positions, look at things in an unusual way. And if we can, humor then becomes a kind of creative tool, right? It allows us a kind of creative liberation. It's the liberty to think in unusual ways, humorous ways. And sometimes it's very good for problem solving. Okay, the last one that we talked about here was is humor and emotion. And you can look at it one of two ways. There is no right answer. It's not a matter of yes, it is, or no, it is not, because both are very valid. Okay, so if you were to argue that it is, here's a reason why. Both have an object that stimulates the person to laugh or consider something humorous. There's a causal relationship between that object and the response that it gives us. We can experience it in various degrees. We talked above here about mild amusement, a smile, for example, a quiet chuckle, or maybe no sound at all, but just inside, right, in our minds. Let's say we're reading a book and we find it funny, but we're not laughing out loud. But we can also go to the point where we are literally laughing so hard we're almost choking because something is just so incredibly funny that it literally stops us in our tracks. So there's a varying degrees. Now, an emotion is not often suppressed very well, right? It can't be stifled. And often if you are laughing, other people around you will kind of laugh. So it is infectious and it's difficult to suppress. So for all those reasons, you can argue that humor is an emotion. Now, on the other hand, you can say no, humor is not an emotion because it takes place at that higher level of cognitive awareness, right? The awareness of what should be versus what is actually going on. And that's not an emotional thing or subjective. It's in fact the way in which our minds operate. We walk around every day with certain expectations and we don't think about it because it's just there. It's who we are. But that degree of amusement and humor takes place at that higher level because it activates our brain and our minds and our expectations. And we can have those expectations subverted or violated or undermined in some way, but we don't we don't fear it. We're not anxious over it because it's just a mild deviation. So because of that, it requires a different kind of thinking, right? Comparative thinking. We compare and contrast what is versus what should be? And all of this is happening mentally, right? It's not happening physiologically. Because when you cry or you laugh, that's a physiological response. Humor, those who believe that it's not an emotion, believe that all of it is entirely in our minds, right? That's where it occurs. So a humorous state of mind is one that is not being necessarily practical or always objective or following the rules, but is playful. It's looking at things in a humorous way. And again, thinking outside the box. Unfortunately, that's the way we look at things. Okay, so module 3, we start looking and thinking about the earliest philosophies of humor, and here's where we hear about superiority theory. Now, the important thing here to remember is that none of these philosophers are supporting humor. They're calling it out. Plato, in particular, did not think much of laughter, didn't think much of poets either, but he did not, he frowned upon laughter, right? Because rather than looking up to the skies and thinking elevated thoughts and pure thoughts, no, actually, it aligns itself with our baser instincts, the fact that we are laughing sometimes at another person's expense. Laughter upsets our perfect human nature, according to Plato, our self-control. Think about laughing, especially when you start laughing at something and it's just so silly that you start laughing literally at anything. You can't stop. And Plato says, no, you've lost control of not your bodily functions, but the way in which your mind operates. So it upsets our nature, our self-control, our intellectual seriousness. All these things really are counterintuitive to the way Plato viewed what we should consider to be our better selves, right? Our better human nature. And of course, too, the kind of malice that we inflict upon others, not for the sake of humor, but we look at another person's pain and we find it funny, right? And even if you stop for a moment and you laugh, you can still go and help the person. But Plato says even that kind of malice is not good. So individuals who do this and engage in this lack virtue and earnestness, right? They're not serious people. Now, because of that, Plato thought that literature should be censored, and the only time that you could ever use humor as a tool would be if you're trying to teach someone, right? If you're trying to have an educational example of what not to do, right? So you highlight sinful behavior using humor, and this is one way in which you can sort of think of the sugar-coated pill, right? It's something that is amusing and humorous, but it masks a serious issue, a serious educational purpose. So that's Plato. Not a big fan of humor because it went against our better selves, and we should censor it as much as we can, unless we're going to use it for education. Aristotle, much more conciliatory, much more willing to entertain the possibilities that humor could be useful. He agreed with him that humor can be immoral. This notion of superiority, the temporary feeling that we have over other people, that's not, it's not, again, in our better nature. But Aristotle said, okay, look, humor is more than that. Sure, we can have humor that attacks individuals and known personalities, because that's what satire is. And satyr plays, as we saw in the videos, was an important part of Athenian culture. But Aristotle said, look, there is the ludicrous, right? The ridiculous, the absurd, which is not an attack on a person. It's just something that is incongruous. So Aristotle is literally the first person to present some kind of positive view of humor in terms of how it works. So incongruous humor, which really doesn't harm anyone, that's not a bad thing. And so laughter can show contempt for others. In the satyr plays, for example, were filled with references to philosophers and politicians and lawyers that the Athenians knew very well, and they would be ridiculed. They would be made fun of in various ways. And and Aristotle said that kind of humor can be instructive, right? It might knock down someone a peg or two because maybe they deserve it. We see this right now with satire based on the American political system and the Canadian as well. But this is not new. This has been going around for a very long time. And Aristotle says, generally speaking, this is a good thing. We can use humor in a tactful way. We can cultivate necessary virtues because, as I mentioned, Aristotle was very interested in virtuous individuals. And we eventually realized that, yes, having a sense of humor or being humorous is not an excess or deficiency in character and in a human characteristic, but in fact, something right down the middle. To have a humorous worldview means that you can rise above it, right? You can rise above the small stuff and kind of see the broader picture. So Aristotle had room in his thinking for humor because it did have some use in terms of satire, contempt for others. We can laugh at another person's shortcomings by way of instructive behavior. And these, again, are not jokes on a person's infirmary or disability, but the way they behave and the way they think and talk, things that can be changed, right? Because otherwise, what's the use of instruction and education if you can't change something in a person? So that's an important distinction. Finally, Cicero, who, again, every time I teach this, I keep thinking about how modern he was as a thinker, because he says that laughter can be created either by things people say or things that they do. That's true. And the laughable can be found in a kind of offensiveness and deformity without coming out and saying it. Now, I'll read the line here. This is the one I'm thinking of, is this passage right here. The laughable can be found in a kind of offensiveness and deformity, for the sayings that are laughed at the most are those which refer to something offensive in an inoffensive manner. This is something that comedians have kind of lost since, I would say, the mid-'80s, where crass humor, vulgar humor seems to be the order of the day. But Cicero is saying you can talk about offensive things, but you don't have to present it in an offensive manner. That's a very modern thought. And Cicero is writing in around 100 AD, right? So that's a long time ago. And yet he presents to us something that we've kind of lost sight of. Now, incongruity for Cicero is also a very important idea. And finally, as an orator, someone that was all involved in public speaking, he thought that an effective speaker can add levity and wit to their discussion, their speech, their conversation, their dialogue, because it allows for people to sort of take a momentary breather and just sort of collect their thoughts. So the occasional joke, an appropriate joke, of course, in a conversation, there's nothing wrong with that. And he also said, and this is another modern thought, the idea that a speaker should be allowed to stray from literal facts when trying to tell a joke, because he says behind humor is often a truth claim of one sort or another. There's something truthful about a comment being made, however funny it may be, that contains a degree of honesty and truthfulness. So if that's the case, we can stray temporarily, of course, for satirical or ironic effect. Now, we cannot turn around and just deviate to the point where we clearly are making things up, but somehow trying to present it as factual. That's where stereotypes now fall into sexism and racism. But he says we can stray from the literal facts in order to tell a joke, because within a joke are certain fabrications that have a truth content in them. Okay, so now we're on to module 4. And now we're talking full on about superiority theories of humor. Now, in the test, don't panic that you need to know who said this, when, where. Consider more the statement itself rather than who said it. If the statement makes sense, it doesn't matter who said it. And when it comes to this section here, because we talk about superiority, incongruity, relief, we are throwing a lot of names out. What's important is to remember what it is. Okay, so that's what I want to point out here. All right, so the first person we looked at was Descartes, and Descartes had this sort of mechanistic view of human nature, that the world and we as individuals were kind of mechanical. And this is why he talks about the aggressive nature of laughter, the explosion of laughter, right? And of course, the loss of self-control in laughter. So he looks at it as a kind of expulsion of air through the throat in the form of laughter, like a buildup of steam, right? That gets released as laughter. So that's this mechanistic view of the world. And we often do it because we're looking at others, and our idea of laughter, or at least Descartes, was related to scorn, derision, ridicule, mockery, satire of one sort or another. And this is a kind of weird mixture of laughing at someone and at their pain, but at the same time, that buildup of that aha moment, seeing someone sort of, suffer something, obviously not fatal, but, epic fail videos are full of these kinds of things that we look at people and we ridicule them because, like, why would you do something so stupid as that? And you laugh and you certainly hope they're okay. But that expulsion of laughter, that buildup of tension and then release, superiority theory here, it overlaps a little bit with relief, which we'll look at in a moment. But Descartes has a mechanistic view of the world. We mechanically, as individuals, explode with laughter based on jokes that are related to scorn and mockery and satire and so on. So that's Descartes. Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, is really someone that identifies and unpacks this notion of superiority very well. And he talks about individuals who, although in Hobbes's ideas and his political theory, each individual is always engaged in a ceaseless struggle, right? So the world and life itself is just a conflict. So if that's the case, if the world is constantly in conflict, then yeah, every once in a while, humor is going to give us that feeling of a sudden glory that we've got something on someone else. We've watched somebody wipe out or do something stupid, and whether or not it hurt them a little bit or a lot, for Hobbes, that's the feeling of a sudden glory. And we feel good about ourselves because we know better, right? Hence the notion of superiority. And we're laughing at other people's sense of inferiority, absurdity, and he calls it basically a kind of malicious enjoyment. So Hobbes and Plato really overlap here in terms of their view of humor as being strictly one of superiority over others. Now, Aristotle had presented us with the notion of incongruity. So let's keep those things in mind. Now, the next person, now we jump from Hobbes writing in the 1600s or late 1500s, to Bergson writing at the very early period of the 20th century. And his notion, again, is really fascinating because he talks about what's called an élan vital, right? A vital force. And this vital force really defines who we are as individuals. And the way Plato thinks that we are eminently wonderful individuals, high-minded and ethical, Bergson says, yeah, we have a life force, right? This vital force that is both evolutionary and creative and self-creating. We've created the world using this kind of vital force. And when we laugh, we're laughing at how that vital force either is pushed to an extreme or kind of dies off. And so laughter is a very human, in his mind, an exclusively human phenomenon. It's also a communal phenomenon because we look at what should be versus what is actually occurring. And he does it this way. He comes up with the metaphors of tension and elasticity. And he says, okay, when human beings reveal themselves to be inflexible, they become potential sources of comedy because despite what is going on, a person continues to try to do something. Remember the video I showed you of the Japanese businessman trying to go the wrong way down an escalator. He is absolutely convinced that he is going to go down that elevator or the escalator. And so he's filled with increasing tension, right? He's inflexible. So by the same token, if we have elasticity, we can kind of roll with the punches, right? We can sort of adopt very quickly. And so even though it is a superiority theory or part of superiority theory, Bergson shows us two different versions of it. The one of inflexibility is where we laugh at others. The one of elasticity is something that we can also do, because if we are inflexible and rigid, we are going to fall into a routine that no matter what is going on, we're just going to carry on. And yeah, we continue to carry on, but we become the butt of a joke because it's pretty clear that things aren't going our way. And if we are immune to it and not seeing it at all, there's probably there's an issue. So that's what I want you to consider with Bergson. It's a notion of tension and elasticity. We become too rigid and inflexible, and we don't see what is going on. We can't kind of accommodate ourselves, right? Because it is a conceptual framework. And elasticity is a good thing. Now, you don't want to go too far one or the other, but we want to be able to adapt and adopt, right? Depending on what's going on. Okay, and John Moriel, the last person, again, he presents his ideas by way of a comparison between the mental rigidity that we see in tragic heroes and the mental flexibility that we see in comedy. So we can have either Oedipus Rex, who goes and does awful things unknowingly, and when he realizes what he's done, he blinds himself with both eyes with a knife. Compare that with the Bill Murray character in Groundhog Day, who at first realizes, hey, what's going on here? And quickly begins to understand how he can use this strange situation that he's in, this recurring present over and over again, to his advantage. So he's mentally flexible, right? So he adapts very quickly and adopts this thing to his own advantage. So that's really where we see the difference between an inflexible tragic character and a very flexible comedic character. In a tragic view, we live as inflexible, idealistic individuals, but in the comic view, we live as social groups that can adopt to one another and whatever may be happening at the same time around us. Okay, so now we get to Module 5, Incongruity Theories, and there'll be one more after this, Relief, but let's take a look at incongruity. Now, again, we've got several names, and as I mentioned, don't worry so much about who said what as much as what was said. So ideas or statements that refer to superiority theory or incongruity, read the statement, see if it makes sense, and then not worry so much about who said it. Now, I'm not going to trick you and say, you know, someone that was clearly not saying it. That's not the point. The point is the statement. Okay, so Hutchinson, Francis Hutchinson, a Scottish philosopher writing in the 1770s, roughly, says, okay, laughter doesn't need to be connected with feelings of superiority. We can laugh at things that are just simply incompatible, incongruous. And again, that sliding scale that Aristotle had talked about so many years before, that if it's a slight deviation, it's funny. It's a tremendous deviation, that could be frightful. So Francis Hutchinson said that things may be incompatible or incongruous and still be funny. That has nothing to do with superiority. It has to do with two things coexisting. And again, that conceptual shift that we can do in our minds between what is versus what should be, therein lies where humor is created. So that's Hutchinson. James Beattie sort of adds on it. He's also another Scottish philosopher, and he adds to Hutchinson's idea this deviation from a presupposed norm or expectation. This is why humor works best when we consider it in terms of social groups. Every social group, every community, every culture has its own expectations of individuals. If that's the case, a norm or expectation that is required or expected of a person, if that is subverted and undermined in some way, it can be funny, but not all the time, right? That sliding scale says that if it's something that is really frightful, then we have something entirely different to deal with. It's no longer humorous. So Beattie is the one that really sort of nails what incongruity is all about. It is a deviation from some presupposed norm or expectation. That's what incongruity is. Now, Immanuel Kant talks about how a joke is set up in the form of a three-part narrative. And there, if you think of a lot of jokes that you can remember telling people, that's essentially what they're doing, right? It's a short story, typically set in three parts, and the last part is the punchline. So a joke sets up a tension and then resolves that tension through the narrative. And what it does is it undermines the narrative because we expect the story to go in a certain direction. There's the narrative expectations. And the punchline subverts it, suddenly moves us in a different space altogether, an incongruous, incompatible space, but one that is still funny because it's within the realm of possibilities. And that's really where the humor works. It turns the strained expectation into nothing more than a joke. And so this is how Kant sees and views and understands humor. A story is set up, a narrative is set up with certain expectations that are built into the joke. And then the third part is the subversion of that expectation to something incongruous, but not something that is so frightful that it now no longer is funny. Now, Kant was not a huge fan of this kind of humor in the first place because, like Hobbes and like Plato especially, he believed that we should be moral and ethical creatures. We should be reasonable creatures. So that kind of laughter beyond incongruity. Kant really had some misgivings about it, but certainly was able to unpack the structure of a joke. And that is really the idea I want you to keep in mind here. Okay, a few more folks. Schopenhauer is the next one. And again, they're really saying the same thing, right? For Schopenhauer, it's where the humor is a version of the world that we hold in our heads as somehow entirely perfect, reasonable, expected. We have certain expectations every single day, and what the world actually is like. So the version of the world that we hold in our heads never quite matches up with what we experience, right? What our senses are telling us. And again, it cannot be a wild deviation, a mild, right? A small deviation. That is what's humorous. So that disconnect between the two is what causes the laughter. So humor is created when we're forced to readjust our perceptions of what the world is actually like. And again, sliding scale, small deviation, humor, large one, that's a big problem. So comic amusement comes from the apprehension, the awareness, and the realization of that particular incongruity, because it disrupts that social norm, that expectation that we have. And the success of the humor depends on really how much the individual understands what that shared culture is, the shared expectations. If you move to an entirely new part of the world and that's utterly different, and you're not aware of cultural expectations and social norms, you're not going to know what a deviation is. And that's essentially what Schopenhauer is saying. Every social world has its own expectations and norms that we need to be aware of before we can see when there is any kind of degree of incongruity. Kierkegaard, again, sort of writing roughly about the same time, 1860s roughly, is saying that comedy is fundamental to life because the world we live in is full of contradictions. And the degree to which we can deal with those contradictions and resolve them in some kind of a painless way is a way that we can cope. Life is a struggle. Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard both saw that. Life is a struggle full of obstacles and contradictions. The degree to which we can, again, not sweat the small stuff, right? That's really what they're saying in a very philosophical language, but that's really what they're saying. Don't sweat the small stuff. It's not worth it. So Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer agree in that sense. And then finally, Roger Scruton really kind of looks in the opposite direction towards incongruity. And he says, okay, look, the content of humor depends on congruity. It depends on resolving the issue, resolving the narrative dilemma, the closure that we're looking for. So he looks at incongruity theory through the structure of humor rather than the content. So the three-part structure is necessary for us to get some degree of closure. And if we don't do that, then the laughs in his mind are not delivered. So incongruity theories argues that it is an undermining of the expectation. And no, Scruton says, really, when you think about it, it's taking two paths toward the same end, or two means to the same ends. He argues that the punchline is actually the resolution of the incongruity. Yes, it is. So it's a matter of semantics here. So Scruton is not sort of out in the wilderness about this. He just looks at it in a different way. He looks at the punchline not as the undermining of the expectation, but the resolution of the incongruity. So either way, you're going to be, you'll have laughter, but it really depends on how you're looking at it, the way in which you think that laughter may operate. All right, so the last one here is relief theory. I'm not sure how long we've been here, maybe 10, 15 minutes, but this is the last part, relief theory. And this is the idea of laughter sort of releasing pent-up energy. There's a little bit of that mechanistic, mechanical model that we saw in Descartes here as well. But these ideas of us being, or the metaphor of us being these mechanical human beings is a very 19th century idea. It does start in view of the world of the human nature and the objective world as somehow ruled by mechanical laws. Now, we don't look at the world anymore that way, but in the 18th and 19th century, the world was looked at exactly this way. So that's why these particular theories work to a certain degree, but remember, these are metaphors. Okay, so relief theory argues that laughter involves the individual releasing pent-up energy. And that pent-up energy is what is created by the joke. And in that sense, it sounds a little bit like Kant. So in the 17th century, humor was the notion of releasing these sort of free spirits, and we liberated this energy that was otherwise held down by rationality and reason. So what that means is we might have sort of infantile, stupid thoughts, even as grown adults, and grown adults should never lose that. We know that never lose that inner child, but you shouldn't have that inner child rule your everyday life either, right? It's there to sort of pop out periodically during moments of humor. And the relief theory is kind of like that. That inner child will laugh at stupid things, and when that happens, according to relief theory, the mechanism, the lid that holds down these infantile thoughts is temporarily released or opened up, and those ideas can come out and can be laughed at. And we laugh with others sometimes at something that is just stupid, silly, absurd, ridiculous. And that is that temporary release of rationality and reason. And we look at something and say, yeah, this is really stupid. And then it closes again and we carry on. So that's really relief theory of the opening, closing, almost like a steam valve. So Herbert Spencer, writing around the 1880s, 1890s, talks about, again, the same thing, the release of pent-up nervous energy. And that nervous energy is created from the anticipation of what we think will happen next. Now, that could be created in the joke, in terms of the narrative that's created, however short it may be. But the built-up tension is there. It's either what we view outside in the world, and we're thinking about that conceptual view of reality and the social norms, and we believe the following is going to happen. We know the laws of gravity work in a certain way. The laws that we follow every day should occur as such. But what's happening with this built-up tension is it's an anticipation of what's going to happen next, and then it's undermined, right? The punchline undermines it in some way. And the nervous energy that is created by the narrative that we invest in, however shortly, but objectively, suddenly discarded and just thrown away. And we just laugh. And it goes away, and then we carry on our day. So that nervous energy created from the narrative or the expectation is discarded in the form of laughter, and Spencer and others believe that this is part of the mechanical or hydraulic view of the mind, that there's a temporary release, an opening up of a kind of lid where these inner thoughts are allowed to pop out and temporarily, and then the lid is closed back down. But again, remember, this is a metaphorical view, not one that is endorsed in this day and age at all, because we have a much more subtle understanding of the way the human mind works. We definitely have a long way to go, but we have a much better understanding of how the mind works, because now we look at the mind in relation to others and in relation to social norms, more so than individuals being mechanically predisposed to laugh at certain things. Now, Freud picks up on Spencer's ideas along the same way, or in the same way, and he talks about laughter that releases psychic energy. And Freud here, again, speaking of his time and place, writing at the turn of the last century, from about 1890 to 1930, roughly. And again, much more repressive times. And he believes that laughter helps us to release its psychic energy that would otherwise be used to hold down some of these taboo ideas. And of course, infantile, they could be sexual in nature, they could be malicious in nature. And we know that's kind of against our better judgment. But something happens where that psychic energy is released, right? The energy that is holding down these thoughts, for some reason, gets let go. And these notions are typically sort of trapped in the unconscious, or at least held down in the unconscious. And comedy provides an escape, right, from the demands that we place on ourselves to be reasonable, rational, objective, and fair, and all the rest of it. And periodically, that lid gets opened up, right? And what's inside is some of these infantile taboo subjects that at the time Freud was writing were considered very taboo. Jokes that were sexual in nature. These days, so what, right? That's just what most people talk about. But at the time Freud was writing, that was much more, again, socially unacceptable. It was a taboo thing. Oh my God, somebody's just made a sex joke. Oh. So you laugh in sort of nervous tension being released. So the joke teller for Freud, this is important. The joke teller needs an audience because the latter needs to validate the joke telling in the first place. both parties need to be aware that what they're saying is a joke. This is not a TED Talk. This is not a conference. It's not an essay being written out loud. This is someone telling jokes. So there is, again, the likelihood of that psychic energy being released on a more regular basis when we are in a comedy club, right? We're listening to a stand-up comic. We could be, the Budweiser Center, hearing a famous comic talking. And we know that is the nature of the work. That is the nature of that space, that environment, that we're going to hear things that may be taboo periodically, and we will nervously laugh because we understand, we conjure up the idea, and that psychic energy that would normally hold down these thoughts is temporarily released. So there are some issues with Freud's idea. His main theory, there is, first of all, the matter of interpretation. Taboo jokes are not always funnier than innocent jokes. Taboo jokes now are just part of the social landscape, the cultural landscape these days. So it's a matter of interpretation. Some people are offended by the legs on a grand piano, and others are not. So taboo jokes and interpretation really go hand in hand. So what Freud is saying of the time was important and relevant, but over time, society has moved beyond that. And the other issue, too, is this notion of psychic energy is somehow mechanical. That's not the case, because we view the mind as operating in a social environment, not in a physiological or purely physiological dimension. So that's the notion of a mechanical worldview. It's old-fashioned. It's just not used anymore. Now, the final person is Mikhail Bakhtin, who takes Freud's ideas, although he was not a Freudian, takes his ideas and he applies it to society, this notion of psychic energy being released. And he looks at humor as a way for us to be able to live with authority figures and authority in general. And it acts as a kind of social safety valve, because if we have something that threatens the status quo, if we look at it in a humorous way, we laugh at it, but the status quo doesn't change, though, does it? We laugh at it, but it carries on the next day. And Bakhtin has this really interesting idea of the carnival and the carnivalesque. And that's when the world is literally turned upside down during a set period of time. Now, the carnival and the carnivalesque really came into being in Western Europe in around the 14 to 1500s. And as agrarian communities slowly evolved into urban communities, industrialized communities, the notion of the carnivalesque really kind of dissipated and it finally disappeared. The closest we have these days is maybe Halloween, where the world is temporarily turned upside down. So the carnivalesque is a moment in time, at a time and place, where the standard codes, conventions, what we expect to happen in the real world are literally suspended or turned upside down. And so what's happening is we have individuals who actively seek to turn all those traditional hierarchies of upper and lower, authority figure versus, minion, everything gets turned upside down. And those carnivalized moments are those where all those standard codes, expectations, conventions are turned upside down, but everyone is aware of it. Everyone knows that this is what's happening. No one stumbles into a carnivalesque moment without being told this is what's happening. So Bakhtin looks at the carnival as a kind of social safety valve. If you've been harboring hostile feelings towards authority figures, whether they're religious leaders, political leaders at that time, you can laugh at them. You can ridicule them, make fun of them. And guess what? The authority figures know that. They let people do that because at the end of the day, the status quo is reestablished and everything is maintained as it is. Nothing gets destroyed. This is not a revolution. It is simply a way for steam to be let off. And that's really what it is. Maybe a good example, but the notion of The Purge, right? The movie The Purge, 3 of them now so far. That's a kind of carnivalesque idea. For 12 hours, people can just do whatever they want. But here, for some reason, everyone wants to kill each other. The carnivalesque is not about killing each other. It's about having fun and making fun of figures that you would not ordinarily be allowed to make fun of. But the carnival gives you that space. So it may challenge those dominant voices of authority, but it does not overturn them. It's not revolutionary. So it does have the potential, right, to oppose and confront that dominant ideology, whether it is political, religious, or a combination, it has the potential, but it's not designed to overturn or revolt in any significant way, because everyone involved in the carnival knows its beginning and its end. It knows the space in which it occurs, and it knows the rules. Even the carnival has its own rules, right? The world is turned upside down. We can make fun of authority figures and carry on and drink in the streets, but it will be over on Sunday. And Monday morning, everyone goes back to work. So that's what the carnival is. It's a social safety valve that siphons off any sort of excess residual energies that might be confrontational or challenging or dangerous, and diffuses them into carnivalesque behavior. So that's essentially it. I'm not sure how long this presentation has been. I'm now going to not share anymore. Whoops, because I'm going to close this here. So I just wanted to present this to you. These are the ideas, the main ideas that are here in this in the first half of this course. Any questions? The test is available to finish until the 19th of February. I had it open until the week after our break week, but I would like you to try to finish it, because there are no readings for this week at all. But if you could finish it, that would give you an actual week off. You wouldn't have to do anything, because we don't pick up anything until the following week. So week 7 should be an actual break. Sorry, week 8 should be an actual break week. So if for some reason you're unable to complete it because you're busy with other things, let me know. But I've got it open until Sunday, February the 19th. And at that point, it will close. Very briefly, the type of test is there will be 4 sections. There are 10 true-false questions. And again, just read the statement, worry less about who says what, but just read the statement and see whether you agree with it. Second is identify and explain. And there will be, I believe, about 12 terms. And I want you to identify and explain only 5 of them. Now, don't panic. It's going to be written there in the question. If you forget how many you have to do, but it says only identify 5 of them. So to identify and explain. Third part, short answer questions. And these are literally short answers that can be finished in three sentences, because each one is only out of 3. So true, false is 10, worth 10. Identify and explain, also 10. The third section, the short answer questions, and there will be 5 of them, each worth 3. That's 15. And in the last part, and there are some options. I believe there's 4 different essay questions that you can mark, or mark if you can respond to. I will only mark 1. So again, choose only 1. And the last part, the longer answer, is worth also 15. So it's out of 50. So 10, 10, 15, and 15. Any questions before you start, fire off a quick email to me. But that's basically it. So there are some options in the second, identify and explain, and the fourth, long answer question. But the first and the third, true and false and short, you have to answer all of those. That's essentially it. So hopefully this video has helped, and I haven't gone too far over the mark. Again, I have no idea. It's maybe been 20 minutes, but I just want to present to you the main ideas in this course. Okay, so good luck, and I will see you hopefully very shortly. But in a couple of weeks when we come back from the break, I will probably do another one of these talking about the third reflection essay. Just make sure that you get those in by the end of next week. And if you do, you're right up to speed. All right, take care, and we'll talk to each other soon. Bye-bye.